Chapter 28 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 28. Death in Life. The telegram that summoned Lady Penrith upon her mysterious journey early on that fatal November afternoon was of the briefest. Found. Come as soon as you like. I wait here for your reply. Coverdale, Lodore Hotel, Keswick. The reply was decisive. I start for Keswick by the 2:40 train today. Mr. Coverdale was waiting on the platform when the train arrived. The grave, kindly face seemed like a welcome, and Lady Penrith felt cheered and sustained by his greeting. He had a carriage waiting for her, looked after her maid and her luggage, and then took his seat beside her and spared her all the agitating questions by telling his story at once and fully. In the first place, I have found him, he said. Plain facts first and details afterwards. I have found him. He is desperately ill, a changed man from the man you remember at Ellerslie. You must bear that in mind, Lady Penrith. You have to prepare yourself for a terrible shock in seeing him after 10 years, which have done more to alter him, poor fellow, than twice the number would in a happy life. Desperately ill. So ill, so changed, she faltered, trying to keep back her tears. Tell me the worst. Don't be afraid to tell me. Will he know me again? Is his mind affected? Seriously affected, I fear. I would not say that reason is altogether gone, but it is no longer a sane mind. There are hallucinations alternating with a dull apathy. The treatment may not have been cruel, has not been actively cruel, for there have been intervals since yesterday in which he has talked rationally and answered all my questions about his life at St. Jude's with perfect clearness. But it has been the worst possible treatment for such a case as his. It has been murder, deliberate murder, and those people at St. Jude's have acted as hired murderers. Mr. Carpew has been your brother-in-law's paid agent. I think there is no doubt of his guilt in that degree. Mr. Urquhart has an extraordinary influence over him, some stronger hold than money, but it is not worth while to enter upon that question. The wrong has been done and cannot be undone. It is possible that this poor fellow might have degenerated in bodily and mental health under the happiest circumstances. What does the doctor say? No doubt you have called in a doctor. A man of the highest repute in the neighbourhood. He considers the case one of epilepsy, pure and simple. Epilepsy in that severe form in which the frequent attacks tend towards lunacy and too often result in lunacy. He does not think the patient likely to be long-lived. Long-lived? A life of misery. Oh, God, to think of what he was when I knew him. Oh, if you could have seen him then, Mr. Coverdale, young, handsome, a king among men, his mind so highly cultivated, knowing and loving all the books I loved, so full of enthusiasm, telling us of adventures that showed such courage and ready wit, unconsciously, for he was the last of men to boast of what he had done. And now you tell me that he is a wreck in mind and body, a creature to be pitied. To hear you speak of him just now as this poor fellow. She burst into tears, crushed and humiliated, as if Brandon Mountford's humiliation bowed her proud head to the dust. Pray bear with me. she said, as Coverdale murmured some consoling commonplace, hardly knowing what he said, his heart aching for her as it had never ached before for a woman in sorrow. Think what it is for me to have loved him as I did love him. Those and these lips told him so only a few hours before Marie Arnold's death, and to find him thus. Bear with me, Mr. Coverdale. You are a good man, my true, kind friend, the only friend I can look to now. Coverdale was silent, not daring to trust himself to speech in answer to that declaration of friendship. "How did you find him?" she asked after a pause. They were driving along the road by the lake through the drizzling rain. An expanse of dark grey water stretched in front of them, with mountains on either side, and wintry gloom brooding over mountain and lake. It was not easy, but still it only required patience and the following up of every clue. I have had to hunt for people in the East End, and I have found out that there is only one way of doing it. I had the Keswick police to help me, 2 men who knew the neighbourhood for a good many miles around, and with their help I soon discovered traces of him. The arrival of an invalid gentleman and his friend at a lonely farmhouse on the further side of Buttermere had been heard of at an inn in the neighbourhood, an inn used by excursionists in summer, but almost deserted at this time of year. We found the man who drove them there, not one of the flymen who ordinarily meet the trains, but a man from a livery yard engaged by a telegram overnight. Had one of the station flies had been employed, we should have made our discovery much sooner, for naturally my first inquiries were among those men. "What kind of a place? What kind of people?" asked Sibyl. "A decent farmhouse. Very lonely, a place to hide in. Decent, kindly people, anxious to do their best for their charge, I believe. He had been sent to them by Mr. Carpew, whom they had known a few years ago when they had a farm near St. Jude's, a farm on your father's estate. They knew nothing of the man who brought him, had never seen him before to their knowledge, but they knew Mr. Carpew and were willing to oblige him. They were to be paid for the gentleman's board and lodging, and for a man to look after him, and all that was wanted was seclusion and secrecy. The poor gentleman had relatives who wanted to put him in a lunatic asylum, and who would perhaps make out a case of lunacy against him if they could get a hold of him, though he was by no means a lunatic. Mrs. Holloway, the farmer's wife, seems a kindly soul, and her sympathies were aroused by this story. Thank God he has not fallen among thieves. So far as these people are concerned, are you taking me to him now? I am taking you to the hotel, where I have engaged rooms for you. I hope you will rest quietly for tonight, and tomorrow morning we will start for the farm as early as you like." "Why should I wait till tomorrow? I am longing to see him, to know the worst about him. You tell me he is ill, a broken man. Your manner implies that he is very ill. He may die before tomorrow morning, and then I shall go down to my grave without having seen the man my foolish, unreasoning love helped to ruin. Lady Penrith, you must not look at this story in that light. No one can tell what influence surrounding circumstances may have had upon him. It is possible that he was doomed to suffer as he has done, that in the brightest lot his fate would have been the same, and if he committed the crime for which he was arrested— No, he did not commit that crime. Don't speak of it. I am angry at the thought of my own folly, the web of lies in which I was caught. Let us go to the farm at once. We can stop at the hotel just to get rid of Ferriby and the luggage, and then drive on. Not on a dark night like this. The distance is too long. The drive would not be without danger. and you would see the patient at his worst, startled by such a late arrival. I want to see him at his worst. I want to know all he has suffered in those long, dreary years. But think what the shock might be for him. He must be prepared for seeing you. Is he not prepared already? Have you told him nothing of my anxiety about his fate, my bitter grief for his sufferings? Yes, I have spoken of you, but perhaps not enough. Be assured it will be better for you and for him that you should defer the meeting until tomorrow. You have been so good to me that I cannot disobey you. Sibyl answered with a sigh. What is the name of the hotel where I am to stop? She asked. The Lador. I thought you would like to be by the lake and away from the town. Yes, I gave them no address when I was leaving. I was afraid Penrith might follow me and interfere in some manner. I must go back tomorrow afternoon, when we have decided what is to be done. Has Mr. Mountford no near relations? Is he quite alone in the world? Quite alone. He has no relation nearer than my uncle, Lord Braemar, and they are only second cousins, a relationship which does not count for much in a large family like my grandfather's. I was interested in him for another reason over and above the relationship. His father loved my mother hopelessly, loved her even after he was bound to another. His son told me the story of that sad, hopeless love. Oh, Mr. Coverdale, forgive me, she said, startled by a stifled sob from the man sitting by her. Pray forgive me if I have touched upon some sad story of your own. No, no, it was nothing, he said hastily. That kind of story, the idea of a hopeless love, a hopeless grief, manfully battled with, is always pathetic. You remember Warrington's story, a mere episode in Pendennis. It moves one more than all the rest of the book, doesn't it? Ah, here we are at the Lador, and now I shall leave you to get as much rest as you can till tomorrow morning. The carriage stopped in front of the hotel. Lady Penrith's maid alighted. The porter took the luggage. Lights shone brightly in the hall within, with all the stir and bustle of an important arrival. Head waiter and head chambermaid were in eager attendance to show the way to her ladyship's rooms. A titled visitor in that dead season of the year was worthy of exceptional respect. I am staying at the Keswick Hotel, Coverdale said as he bade good night, but I will be with you as early as you like tomorrow, and a carriage and pair of good horses. You'd better bring your maid. The journey will be long and tiring, and if we should have a hopelessly wet day... I'm not afraid of bad weather. Would 8 o'clock be too early for you to be here? Not too early for me. If I can get the livery people to stir early, I will be with you at 8. Only I beg that you will try to rest tonight. They have given you rooms looking towards the lake, and I hope the sound of the waterfall will be only loud enough to serve as a slumber song. Do not think of me. You have taken worlds of trouble. I don't know how I should ever thank you. Don't thank me. I have to take much more trouble at the East End for duty's sake. It will be my most cherished memory that you look to me for help in your anxieties. Good night. He did not even stop to shake hands with her, but left with a stiff bow, which seemed curiously at variance with the suppressed emotion in his voice. He went back to the carriage through the rain, and she heard him drive away, leaving her with the long evening before her in a strange hotel. A 2 hours' drive through the morning mists brought Lady Penrith and her companion to a solitary farmhouse hidden amongst the hills, a spot more lonely than even St. Jude's vicarage. But this rustic homestead, with its group of barns and stable yard in the background, and its little garden where autumn flowers still lingered, had a more cheerful aspect than the straggling stone house at St. Jude's with its walled garden and gloomy firs. Brandon Mountford. Yes, this was Brandon Mountford. This tall, wasted figure, this hollow-eyed countenance, with the downward melancholy lines about the mouth, and the nervous contraction of the brow, and the wasted hands that lay in helpless inaction on the arms of the chair. Sibyl stood gazing at him in awe-stricken silence, almost as she might have looked at a ghost. She could find no words to say to him, no words of pity or affection. Speech seemed frozen. Vainly had Coverdale sought to prepare her for the shock. The anguish of the spectacle was not lessened by anything that he had told her. The silence lasted for minutes. Coverdale heard the old clock in the passage ticking solemnly on, as if it were measuring out a long lifetime. So hopeless seemed the duration of that agony. The woman standing statue-like, white as marble, the man sitting with eyes that glazed idly out beyond the open window across the little garden, where the asters and marigolds made a bank of gaudy colour to the grey dimness of great rugged hills. The mist had cleared from the lower landscape, and the air in the shelter of the hills had a summer-like softness. At last, over the blank melancholy of that altered face, there crept a slow, vague smile, and Brandon Mountford lifted his eyes towards Sibyl. "I knew that you would come," he said slowly. "I knew that you would understand my message, though I have almost lost the trick of writing." "Brandon, you know me! You know me!" she cried, sinking on her knees by his chair, clasping one of his wasted hands, deadly cold to her touch. "Know you? Yes, of course. You have been cruelly treated. But that is all over now. All that this world can give you of happiness shall be yours. It shall be my care, the object of my life, to atone for your sufferings." "No, no. There has been no cruelty. It was my doom, the curse laid upon me. What could they do but hide me from my fellow men, a wretch, a murderer? I have suffered, but I have had my dreams of that wild country where I was so happy, centuries ago, centuries of weariness and pain. The black faces came back to me in dreams, the river, the forest, and I have dreamt that you and I were happy there, you and I, sitting together by the campfire. I have seen your face in the red light, and then the fire has changed to the fire of hell, and I have suffered like a soul in everlasting agony. I have suffered for my crime." In broken sentences, with piteous entreaty, she protested against his self-denunciation. "It is a dream," she said, "a horrible dream. You had nothing to do with poor Marie's death, except the misfortune to be the first to find her. You have been the victim of a diabolical conspiracy, a plot to hide away an innocent man in order to prevent suspicion falling on the real murderer." He looked at her curiously, as if lapsing into a reverie in which her words hardly reached him, looked at her wonderingly, as if her face were strange to him, and then his eyes wandered away from that earnest, eager face to the gaudy autumn flowers and the great grave hills veiled in the thin white mist. Alas, it was but too evident that the shadows which clouded his reason only cleared away now and again for a brief space, as the autumn haze parted and patches of the hillside showed clear and bright through a rift in the veil. "It is not wise to talk to him of that dreadful event," said Coverdale. "What we have to consider is what is best to be done for him. The doctor will be here at 12 o'clock. You may be glad to hear his opinion from his own lips." "Yes, I should like to hear what he thinks. But ought we not to have a specialist? We might telegraph to Edinburgh." "There will be time for that by and by. Will you come into the garden with me?" "What, leave him alone?" "He has been accustomed to sitting alone. The woman of the house is within call. I should like to have a quiet talk with you out yonder." Sibyl did not answer him, scarcely heard him, perhaps. She was looking at Brandon Mountford in agonized contemplation. Whatever there had been of intellect or of power in his face a few minutes ago had vanished. Weakness, physical and mental, was all that could be read in that face now, a countenance of sickly pallor, every muscle relaxed, dull misery expressed in every languid line. This is what solitude and silence, the slow decay of monotonous years, had done for Brandon Mountford. If Sibyl could have looked back along that dark line of years, if some magic mirror could have shown her the pictures of the past, what would she have seen? First, a strong man caught in a trap, fighting with his captors for the release into free air of heaven, then suddenly subjugated and rendered powerless, not by their violence or their persuasion, but by the fell disease which the horrors and agitations of his life had intensified, which set its grip upon body and brain with a force never felt till then. She would have seen one seizure following upon another, with brief intervals of languor and exhaustion, till strength was sapped and intellect weakened but not destroyed. She would have seen a brave man submissive as a child to a bondage from which he could have been broken had he so willed, submissive because despairing. He was told that he was a murderer, that a warrant was out against him, that to escape from that dull prison house, that life of hopeless monotony, might be to doom himself to the gallows, or at least to the imprisonment of a state madhouse, a felon among felons, a lunatic among lunatics. She would have seen him, as his brain weakened and the power of consecutive thought gradually diminished, fooled by the hope of release. He should be got away later, when the coast was clear, should be got on board a steamer and drafted away to that dark continent of which he dreamt so often, where liberty and life were waiting for him, among the dark faces under the tropical sun, cozened from day to day, and month to month, from year to year, with that reiterated by and by. She would have seen him turning the pages of books that he had once loved, reading and forgetting what he had read, and she would have seen him gradually losing count of days and months and years, till time was one long blank, and his life knew no change save the change from heat to cold, and back to heat again, from sunshine pouring in at his open windows to the early darkness of endless winter nights, from the dark iron blank where the firelight had leapt and sparkled so merrily, to the welcome fire glow coming back again to fill the dull black void. No changes save the rain whipping at the window panes, the wind roaring over the distant sea, or shrieking in the chimney. There was thunder sometimes, a thunder peal that shook the house, and made him wish the roof would crack and the walls crumble and bury him among dust and ruin, and so make an end of this dull blank space and time, which seemed to be endless, infinite space, infinite time. He repeated the words sometimes as if they had been a formula. "Who disputes that either is infinite? I have proved them both," he said. For not only did time seem endless, immeasurable, but in his frequent periods of hallucination, space also seemed without limit, and his weary spirit wandered in worlds that knew neither change nor boundary, neither night nor day, dim greyness peopled by silent ghosts, an endless labyrinth, or a wide stretch of barren sand leading to a horizon that was always the same, and yet forever receding. The commonest dreamer in a dream of a minute can invent and people a place unknown to his waking intelligence, but in the diseased brain that dreaming power, increased 100-fold, becomes a source of unspeakable suffering, a wellspring of horror. And what of his more rational hours, those longer intervals between one attack and another, when there was time for the brain to regain some touch of reasoning power? Alas, those hours of reason and remembrance were the worst of all, for in those he believed himself Marie Arnold's murderer, recalled the image of the corpse in the wood, brooded over the cruelty of such an end to that bright young life, and the shame and disgrace of the crime, disgrace reflecting upon all who were of his name and blood. "Better that I should rot in this seclusion," he told himself in those waking hours, "than that I should go out into the world to set men talking of my crime. Yet if it were possible, if I could get clear of England without scandal, could get back to the Zambesi and my faithful Kaffir boys, they would hardly think worse of me for that story of bloodshed. They would only pity me as the victim of witchcraft." And in such an interval, when his custodian came to him with the meal which only Mr. Carpew or his wife ever served to the mysterious boarder, Brandon Mountford would urge the fulfilment of that reiterated promise. Surely the time had come when he might go away. Whatever watch had been kept upon the house must have ceased long ago. He had lost all count of time, but he knew it must be long, and he looked down at his clothes, which had been replaced by ready-made garments more than once since he came there, and which were threadbare and worn at the edges. He looked at his wasted hands, where the muscles had been so firm and the flesh so hard and brown in those old days by the Salmon River. Yes, it was long, very long. Suspicion, watchfulness, must have worn out long ago. Why could he not get away? The vicar had various excuses. The danger was not over. His lodger was a marked man. Any movements in that lonely spot would excite curiosity. And then there was the question of money. It would cost a good deal of money to get him out of England and to pay his passage to the Cape. "And you wouldn't like to land there penniless," said the vicar. Penniless, yes. Penniless under those stars. He would not fear. Besides, he had friends in London, friends who would gladly help him, men to whom money was no account, if he could remember their names or where to find them. Ah, there was the agony. He could not remember. Names, localities, even the faces of the past were lost in thick mists of forgetfulness. Faces haunted him, faces appeared to him, rooms in which he seemed to have lived, gardens whose every tree and shrub seemed familiar, but he could not distinguish memories from dreams, the things which he had been, that were even real today, from the things which his fancy invented. If Sibyl could have known how, through the clouds that darkened mind and memory, one image had shone like a star, unchanged and unforgotten, and that image hers. If she could have heard his appeal to his jailer, repeated day after day, "Let me see her," as she had my letter, Have you sent a messenger to Ellerslie, as you said you would? And how, day after day, he was put off with excuses and postponements. He was told that she had married Lord Penrith and was a leading light in the London world. It was implied that she had forgotten her unhappy kinsman and was indifferent to his fate. She was abroad in the south of France, an assertion that had been justified by her actual absence in several winters. But the same story had been told him when she was at Killander Castle. Tomorrow, and tomorrow. There had always been the same promise that his desire should be realized by and by, and as the brain weakened, he had grown to believe in that by and by, and to wait and watch for her coming. He had written many such scrawls as the one which reached her hands, but on that last occasion he had been fortunate in his messenger, a starveling jack-of-all-trades who lived in a hovel at St. Jude's and did odd jobs for the farmers. The key had been left in the lock of the garden door for once in a way, and Brandon, who was allowed to walk alone in this joyous enclosure, had opened the door unobserved and gone out. He had no idea of escape now, having been told that escape was hopeless. He was too weak and helpless to even contemplate any act requiring prompt decision or sustained exertion. He only wanted to see Sibyl, to find some messenger who would carry his appeal. The garden door opened on the heath, but he could hear the sound of a pick in the road a little way off, and could see a bent figure breaking stones. It was the jack-of-all-trades doing a spell of parish work, and to him Brandon Mountford entrusted his message, hastily written upon a fly-leaf torn out of the book he had been reading as he stood on the windy road. He entreated the man to find Lady Penrith, to put that bit of paper into her hand, and no other. He offered his watch as payment in advance for this service, but the man would not take it. The rough peasant was touched with awe and pity at the sight of that spectral face, and he was too honest to accept so valuable a gift. Half-witted himself, he may have had some instinctive sympathy with Brandon's clouded mind. He promised that the letter should reach Lady Penrith, whatever trouble it might cost him to find her, and he kept his word with a dogged faithfulness that would have done honour to the strongest intellect. And thus, by the accident of a key left in a lock, and by one act of forgetfulness on Mr. Carpew's part, Brandon Mountford had been released from a living grave. "Have you made any plan for his future?" Coverdale asked, as he and Sibyl walked up and down beside the privet hedge which divided the garden from the road. "I thought if we could take him to Ellerslie he might be happy there. He could have good servants. I could rely on Mrs. Morrison's care of him." "Not to be thought of for a moment," said Coverdale decisively. "In the first place, Ellerslie would recall the tragedy which changed the current of his life. The effect on his mind might be disastrous." "True, I forgot that. I have lived down the horror of those associations myself, and I forgot. Yes, you are right. Ellerslie would never do. Remember the warrant against him. Wretched wreck as he is, he might be put through all the torture of a magistrate's inquiry, might be indicted for murder, and have to stand his trial. The result, a state madhouse. Ellerslie would not do." No, the risk would be too great. Then what do you advise?" "Leave him where he is for the present, perhaps till the spring. I have made inquiries about these people, and they bear an excellent character in the neighbourhood. The man a hard-working tenant farmer whose father and grandfather worked on the land before him. The woman honest and God-fearing. Their connection with Mr. Carpew is simple enough. He was curate at the nearest parish church for a year before Lord Penrith gave him the living of St. Jude's, and during that year he became very friendly with the farmer and his wife. They are kindly people. Mr. Mountford will be perfectly safe under this roof until we can think of something better. But what if the men who brought him here should remove him somewhere else, and we should lose sight of him again? I don't think it will be attempted. In the first place, we must engage a trustworthy attendant, accustomed to such cases, who must be responsible to us for his safety, with a man under him to relieve guard. I shall go straight from here to St. Jude's, and after I've talked to Mr. Carpew, I don't think there will be any further attempt to interfere with this poor man's liberty. The vicar of St. Jude's will see the peril of his conduct, and I will put it before him, as I mean to do. You might frighten him, but he is only the tool of a wickeder man, a man who will not hesitate at a crime. And then Sibyl urged the necessity of removing Brandon Mountford out of the power and beyond the knowledge of the man who had hidden him from his fellow men in order to sustain the suspicion, the almost certainty, that he was the murderer of Marie Arnold. So long as everybody at Ardliston believed in Brandon's guilt, no one took the trouble to look anywhere else for the criminal, said Sibyl. That must have been the motive of his imprisonment. To leave him in the power of Hubert Urquhart would be madness. And how can we be sure of his safety so long that that wretch knows where to find him? Mr. Urquhart is your husband's brother. It seems a hard thing to suppose him such an unmitigated scoundrel. Ask my husband for his brother's character if you doubt my estimate of him. But surely he would not suspect his brother of murder. Perhaps not, but he would tell you that he is vile enough to make any suspicion justifiable where he is concerned. Dear Mr. Coverdale, there is only one thing to be done. We must get Brandon out of this man's custody and into our own. Let us run all risks as to that warrant of 10 years ago, and take him to Ellerslie. He will be safe there with my housekeeper and my father's trusted secretary, Andrew Orlebar, a man who knows the whole story, and who would go through fire and water to help me. You cannot take him to Ellerslie, to the scene of the murder, without arousing curiosity among your neighbours. However few they are, there are enough of them to talk, and to revive the old story and the old suspicions. If a few days hence he were to be arrested, you would be sorry. Yes, you are right. It might be dangerous. Oh, Mr. Coverdale, what are we to do? We seem so hemmed-round with difficulties. Here is a life, a poor, ruined life, which has been given back to me as if out of the grave. Am I to jeopardize it, lose it again? Think what can be done. Something must be done to save him from the villain who plotted against him, may be his accomplice in my blind folly. There was a silence that seemed interminable to Sibyl's anxiety, as John Coverdale walked slowly up and down the shingly path by her side. She could see that he was deep in thought, and would not interrupt his cogitations by a word. Her patience was rewarded presently. He had thought out a plan, which he submitted to her briefly. My father has a shooting box in Argyllshire. He was there with some friends in August and September, but the place is deserted now, except for a keeper with his wife and a few shooting dogs. I will telegraph to the hospital at Carlisle for an attendant. Wait here till he comes, and when he comes, start at once for Scotland with Mr. Mountford. If he will trust himself to me, I can install him in my father's cottage in the care of the keeper and his wife, who are old servants, and will implicitly obey my orders. There could be no better plan, if Lord Workington will lend you his cottage. No difficulty about that. A telegram will settle the business. I must wait here till the attendant comes from Carlisle. You can return to the castle this afternoon, and you can send my telegrams from the nearest office on your way back. But to leave you here, to take so much of your time, don't mind that. I was to have Ben in London tomorrow afternoon, but one of my messages will be to the friend who is taking my duty, asking him to give me one more Sunday. By Monday or Tuesday I hope to have established Mr. Mountford at the hut, and from there I shall go straight to London. You may believe that I shall not abandon him until I am assured of his safety. I believe in your wisdom and goodness as I believe in heaven. I can never thank you enough for what you are doing. He will thank you perhaps some day better than I can, if the power to think ever comes back. Thank you for life saved, reason restored." And then she gave him a cheque for £100, which she had written before leaving the hotel for travelling and other expenses. She begged him to be lavish, to use the power of gold to the utmost. She would send further cheques as they were needed. He smiled his grave, sad smile at her eagerness. "It would be an impertinence on my part to refuse to let you pay any charges I might incur on your kinsman's account," he said. "But there will not be much money wanted. And now may I send for your carriage and your maid? You must be anxious to be on your way home again. I can write the telegrams while the carriage is being brought round." "Yes, there is no time to lose. You will tell the house surgeon at Carlisle that the attendant is wanted for a friend of Lord Penrith. My husband is a supporter of the hospital, and the authorities will do their utmost to oblige him. But I am to see the doctor," she said, looking at her watch. "It is past 12, and he was to be here at 12. I must wait to hear what he says about the journey to Scotland. And may I see Mr. Mountford one more time before I go, may I not?" "Certainly, if you like." Sibyl went alone to the parlour where Mountford was sitting by the fire, while the farmer's wife, a kindly-looking woman, was laying the table for a meal. "The gentleman has a very poor appetite," she explained as she cut strips of toast to accompany a basin of broth. "It's difficult to get him to take his nourishment. He's nothing but skin and bone, poor soul." Poor soul. Pity the wreck of humanity that was Brandon Mountford's portion now. He looked up with sudden flush and a brightening of the haggard eyes. "Ah!" he cried, as if seeing Sibyl for the first time. "My messenger found you. Oh, my beloved, how I have waited and watched for your coming." He stretched out his wasted hands to her in passionate greeting. He had no memory of half an hour ago, when he had greeted her with almost the same words. The evidence of a decayed intellect cut her to the quick. The doctor came into the room at this moment, a young man, but serious and intelligent. He looked at his patient, sat by his side for about 10 minutes, questioning and observing him, then went out into the garden with Lady Penrith. "Be frank with me," she entreated. "It is a very bad case, is it not?" "Yes, it is a bad case." "Incurable?" One hardly likes to call any disease incurable nowadays. Medical science has taken to working miracles. Surgeons are cutting epilepsy out of the brain as they cut cancer out of the body. And with as much or as little success. With the same probability of success and the same hazard of failure, perhaps. He ought to be seen by a specialist, a man who has made epilepsy the study of his life. Yes, it would be well, by and by, for the satisfaction of his friends, that this poor gentleman should have the benefit of the highest opinion. But there will be time enough for that when his bodily strength is restored, if it can be restored, by care and good nursing. "You find him seriously, dangerously ill?" "Not dangerously ill, but in a very low and feeble condition, in a state which would make any illness dangerous, a chill, a fever, an attack of bronchitis. He would have no resisting power. He has been cruelly treated, kept in worse seclusion than if he had been in a madhouse. Solitude, silence, dull rooms, no change of air and scene. All very bad, no doubt, in a case such as his. And now it is proposed to take him on a long journey to Argyllshire. Can he bear such a journey? Certainly, as travelling is managed nowadays, he might be taken at night in a sleeping carriage with the greatest care, and with someone in attendance to administer stimulants. There need be no risk in such a journey, weak as he is, if the drive to here in Keswick is not made too fatiguing. Care shall be taken, the utmost care. We are sending to Carlisle for a nurse, but if you could spare the time to go with him, to superintend the journey, your fee should be anything you like to name. In a case of this kind, there can be no question as to expense. You are very good. If you were to travel at night, I think I might spare the time from my other patients, and my fee should not be exorbitant. My practice is not a very remunerative one, and I have no pressing case just now which would make my absence hazardous. I need not be away more than 18 hours if we travel by the night mail. Everything shall be arranged to suit your convenience. Your presence will be a comfort to me and to Mr. Coverdale, who is now taking my poor cousin to Scotland, and you will see the attendant and give him full instructions as to treatment," continued Sibyl. "I will do everything that thought or experience can suggest. Then my mind will be at ease about him. Please write to me immediately after you return, and I shall have the pleasure of sending you a cheque." The doctor smiled, for he did not even know the name of this beautiful woman, whose earnestness and evident affection for that ruined life impressed him deeply. He asked no questions, for he knew enough about Lord Workington's son to know that he had to do with people of good position. The carriage was waiting in the accommodation lane which made the only approach to the homestead. Her ladyship's maid was there, and there were wraps and rugs enough in the open carriage for a journey to St. Petersburg. Once again, Sibyl went back to the farmhouse parlour, and alone with Brandon Mountford this time, bent over his chair and pressed her lips to his wan forehead. Oh, God, the memory of that first kiss in the garden at Ellerslie, before the coming of sorrow. This might be her last memory of him. Who can tell? He was passing out of her sight once more. Who could tell if life would ever bring them face to face again? Life is so full of sad surprises, she thought, as she drove away from that quiet hollow in the hills, remembering the sudden trouble of 10 years ago, and in no wise foreshadowing that terrible surprise which was waiting for her within the hour. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 29. The Furies on the Hearth. Fatal accident to the Earl of Penrith. That was the sentence in large capitals upon a newspaper board which caught Sibyl's eye as she drove through Keswick on her way to the railway station. Absorbed in thought, her eyes looked at street and shop windows and people, seeing things but not noticing them. Her husband's name startled her from that profound reverie, that sad comparison of past and present. Fatal accident. What accident? And the word fatal. What did that mean? She called to the coachman to stop, but he had hardly pulled up his horses when she let herself out of the carriage and rushed into the shop. "The newspaper," she asked, holding out a trembling hand. "The paper with the account of the accident." The somewhat sleepy shopkeeper, roused from a droning conversation with a fellow townsman, wondered at this unknown lady's pallor and agitation. He stared at her as he handed her the newspaper and made no remonstrance when she left the shop without paying for it. "Queer," he remarked as he went on serving stationery to the customer whose business and conversation had been interrupted. "That must be somebody connected with Lord Penrith. I shouldn't wonder if it was his wife." The carriage had not moved on yet. Lady Penrith was sitting where the two men could watch her as she tore open the paper, looking hurriedly up and down the columns till she came to what she wanted. Fatal accident. What did that word fatal mean? A limb shattered, the loss of an eye, some irreparable injury which would make life less fair to the sufferer? Or must that word signify something worse than lameness or blindness? Had the word but one significance? Must it mean the end of all things? How long it seemed before she found the column she wanted in the 8 pages of that flimsy local paper. At last, here it was, headed in large type at the top of a column. "We regret to report the death of the Earl of Penrith, who was shot yesterday while trying to pass through a gap in a hedge in his own estate, a short distance from Killander Castle. It is supposed that the trigger of the gun was caught by a twig in the quick-set hedge, and that his lordship's injuries were immediately fatal. He had been dead some time when he was found lying in the gap, with his gun near him. The Earl was in the prime of life, having been born," etc., etc., etc. "Drive on to the station as fast as you can go. Stop. The man must be paid for his paper," said Sibyl, handing her purse to Ferriby, who had alighted from the carriage and was standing at the door, watching her mistress's agitated countenance. "There is no hurry. The train will not start any sooner because I am anxious to be at home. We shall have a long time to wait." That delay seemed eternal to Lady Penrith, sitting in the waiting-room, at first in solitude and silence, then amidst the bustle of fidgety travellers coming in and going out. Dead. The husband with whom she had sat at breakfast yesterday morning, in that formal intercourse which seemed to the outside world more like an armed neutrality than a happy marriage. They had always been polite to each other. They had never frustrated each other's wishes in large things or in small. Each had enjoyed perfect liberty to take life as pleasantly as possible, but each had known, and had not even affected not to know, that love went for nothing in their union. Penrith had kept the promise of his courtship. He had been, according to his lights, a good husband. Dead. Could it be true? Was not that paragraph written in error on the first hasty report of the disaster, the extent of the calamity exaggerated by outsiders in the confusion of the household? Well, she would know all in a few hours. It had never occurred to her in agitation that she might have telegraphed to the castle and received a reply to her questions halfway on her journey. But during the last 5 minutes of waiting, Ferriby reminded her that it would be necessary to telegraph to the stables for her carriage to meet her at the station, and Ferriby ran to the office with a hastily written message. The inquest had been held at noon, and all was tranquil at the castle when Sibyl arrived. Silence and gloom prevailed in the darkened house, a silence and darkness as of the grave where Lord Penrith was to lie before many days and nights were over. There had been very little trouble for coroner or jury, very little room for question or conjecture, nothing mysterious in the accident they are required to investigate, no room for difference of opinion. The gun lay on the table before them. It was passed from hand to hand by and by, and those who handled it were more impressed by the beauty of the weapon than by any need of considering how it had happened to be fatal to its possessor. The catastrophe was so commonplace, so common, a repetition of old experiences, and pointed only to the familiar moral that it is better for a man to lose a few seconds in reloading his gun, even if he miss a bird by that brief delay, than to risk carrying a loaded gun over rough ground in a long tramp homeward. Lord Penrith had saved himself a little trouble and had thrown away his life. That is how the coroner and the jury read the story of his death. A sad pity. A man still in the prime of life, hard as nails, a fine shot, a splendid horseman, and in the enjoyment of an estate which it had been the business of her ladyship's life to bring to perfection. He had died childless. That was the worst of it, and his title and estate would pass to Hubert Urquhart, a man of the worst possible reputation. Gambler, blackleg, profligate, a man who, at the age of when a son of a local magnate is generally liked and looked up to in the neighbourhood of his father's house, had been hated and despised, a youth who had always preferred bad company to good, who had taken his pleasure grossly at rustic race meetings and village fairs, a man who, while consorting with jockeys and small horse dealers, had shown no more respect for his humbler neighbours than if he had been at Unyanyembe or Ujiji. Never had a young patrician been more heartily disliked than Hubert Urquhart in Cumberland. He had not even the good qualities that should have gone with his defects. He had affected low company without ever achieving popularity, even in the saddle-room or at the village inn. There had been a hardness about him, the Urquhart hardness, which gave a sting to his jests and made his familiarity with inferiors brutal instead of friendly. He had cultivated the company of grooms and horse dealers because they amused him, but he had never disguised his absolute contempt for them as a lower order of creatures. Mr. Urquhart appeared on the scene an hour after Lady Penrith's return. He had come post-haste from Perth, where he had spent the previous night on his way to the Highlands, and where he had seen the news of his brother's death in the morning papers. He had sent his card to his sister-in-law, begging her to see him, to which request she replied in a letter of 3 lines. "No, not today. 3 or 4 days hence I will see you. I have something to say about the past and your part in it." The funeral was over. All the late Earl's tenantry and all there was of gentle blood within 20 miles of the castle had been represented in the long line of mourning carriages that had followed the open hearse, where the Earl's coronet on the crimson velvet pall was touched with gleams of wintry sunlight as the cortege moved slowly along the moorland road. Crimson and gold made a splendour in the cold grey nave of the church at Cargill, where for many generations the Urquharts had been buried in a vault underneath the chancel. That subterranean burial place had been closed for the last 40 years, and Sibyl's husband was to lie in his father's grave in the little cemetery on the hillside at the end of the village street. Hubert Urquhart was the chief mourner, and returned to the castle to hear the reading of the will, a business promptly dispatched, for the will was of the briefest. The late Earl had only his surplus income to dispose of, and his bequests were limited to a legacy of £1,000 to his niece, Coralie Urquhart, £100 each to his valet and coachman, and £50 to every servant who had been 5 years in his service. His personal effects, books, pictures, plate, and jewellery, not heirlooms, he left without exception to his wife. To his brother and heir presumptive he bequeathed not so much as a snuff-box or a walking-stick. Hubert Urquhart stood with his back to the fire, listening to these details in a gloomy silence. He made no remark when the lawyer finished, and he looked at him doubtfully, waiting his lordship's instructions. "Thank you, Grant," he said at last, as if waking from a reverie. "The will is eminently discreet. My brother had very little to leave, except those things as were brought with his wife's money. It is right those things should revert to her. Go to your luncheon, Grant. I shall smoke my cigar quietly here. I seldom eat at this time of day." "But your lordship has had an exhausting morning. Wouldn't it be better to eat a heavy meal?" "No, my dear fellow. But you can tell a servant to bring me a brandy and soda. Good day to you, if we don't meet again." This was a shrewd indication of his lordship's desire that they should not meet again. The solicitor put the will in his pocket and left the room without another word. There was a new stateliness about his client, whose affairs had compelled occasional resort to him in the past, and who had been a good deal more familiar in those impecunious days. "The new Earl is putting on side," mused Mr. Grant. "But he'll soon be coming to me to settle with his creditors. They'll want 20 shillings to the pound now, and he won't want to give them as much. I wish I'd brought up a little of his lordship's paper. Might have been dirt cheap last week." The new Lord Penrith smoked his cigar by the library fire, sitting in a low armchair, in a restful attitude, his long legs stretched straight before him, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, his head bent a little. Every now and then his eyes glanced upward with a curious look at the spacious room and the walls of books which nobody ever read. The late Earl's writing table stood in front of the great Tudor window, with the seals upon all the drawers, and all the scattered litter of life cleared away from the top, leaving the blank emptiness of death. It was something to be master in such a house as this, and the house near Berkeley Square, the house whose doors had been shut against him for the last 10 years, just as inexorably as the door of this Cumbrian fortress. No more shutting of the doors against him, Hubert Urquhart. No more empty pockets and importunate Jews threatening every hurtful process that was left in the law of debtor and creditor. His troubles were over. He could stretch his legs by the fireside, smoke the best cigars that tropical Spain could produce, take his ease. The days of difficulty were done. "You hadn't done me a single kindness in your 10 years of prosperity," he said, apostrophizing his brother's portrait, which looked down at him from the panel above the mantelpiece. "You had a good inning and an easy death. Do you expect me to be sorry for you? I wonder if there be consciousness or knowledge in the place where you are." The door opened, and the butler ushered in Lady Penrith. Urquhart dropped his cigar in the fender and started to his feet. He had courted this interview, but it was not the less a shock when the moment came. He faltered something confusedly and drew a chair to the hearth. "I am not going to sit down," Sibyl said icily. "I told you I wanted to see you after the funeral. This is your house now. My carriage is at the door, and as soon as I have said what I have to say, I shall leave the castle forever." "My dear Lady Penrith, I hope you understand that this house, and any other house which I possess, is laid at your feet. Pray spare yourself the trouble of making fine speeches," she answered with a look which should have blighted him. "You know very well that nothing would induce me to enter any house that sheltered you, unless I came there to denounce you, as I might denounce you, as I would, had I not some regard for the name you bear, as I would denounce you, even at the sacrifice of that name, if my faith in God's justice were not stronger than my faith in a British jury." The ghastly change in the brazen audacity of his face told her that he was hard hit. He gnawed his nether lip for a few moments in silence, looking up at her from under bent brows with eyes that would have killed her if hatred could kill. "What do you mean?" he muttered huskily after a pause. "I mean that you are twice a murderer." He sprang forward a step or two, his arm lifted and fist clenched. It cost him no small effort of will and muscle not to bring that clenched fist down upon the fair pale face like a sledge-hammer. He knew that one such blow would kill her, and he would have liked to kill her. He longed to see her dead at his feet. "I am not afraid of your violence. You could do me no more harm than you have done if you were to kill me. You spoilt my life. You took all the hope and love and gladness out of my happy girlhood, so happy till you blighted it. You murdered my adopted sister and broke my father's heart." "I murdered her? Great God! Hear what this woman says." "I believe there is a God who hears and will punish your crimes. It costs you nothing to call upon a God in which you do not believe. I say that it was your hand which killed Marie Arnold. It was you who wanted to marry her, wanted money with her, and tried to make a bargain with my father, and had been refused, and, goaded by her contempt for you, that devil of rage and cruelty which has always looked out of your cold, cruel eyes, took possession of you, and you murdered her. And then, when fate brought Brandon Mountford to the spot, and circumstantial evidence pointed to him as the murderer, it was your interest to confirm that suspicion by every means in your power, best of all by getting him out of the way, and making him a fugitive, a prison breaker. And to do this, you worked upon my feelings. You took advantage of my love for him, my ignorance of life and its responsibilities. You made me the instrument of his destruction. And then came your second murder, the merciless imprisonment of a man for whom, of all men, a free existence under God's sky meant health and life. You made his days and nights a dreary blank, his world a prison of 4 walls and half an acre of gloomy garden. If there was ever a murder done on earth, that was murder. "Oh, you call that murder, do you, Lady Penrith?" said Urquhart with a saturnine grin. "I saved a homicidal lunatic from the gallows, or the criminal ward in a state asylum. I put him quietly out of sight, where he was taken excellent care by an educated gentleman and his wife, and you call that murder? I say that it was a viler crime than even your murder of Marie Arnold. That may have been the work of a moment's fury, an ungovernable impulse of a man's wickedness. But the slow torture of years, the living death which you, the murderer, inflicted upon an innocent man? A man who was taken red-handed by the side of his victim. My dear Lady Penrith, raving such as this can admit of no reply. No sane man would take the trouble to argue with you." He turned his back upon her as he bent down to draw the smouldering logs together. Beads of sweat had been standing on his forehead for a few minutes ago, but he was calm and self-possessed now, and his hard, sharply cut face wore its old look of effrontery. "I am informed that your friend has been removed from the quiet retreat in the mountain air and amidst fine scenery, where I placed him when it was considered that a change might be useful." A change, after 10 years of dismal monotony. A change, after mind and memory had been blotted out in that dreary solitude. Lady Penrith, you are not a doctor, and I am not here to discuss Mr. Mountford's case with you. If you want to let the light on his history, mental or otherwise, you had better let the warrant be executed which was issued against him 10 years ago as a suspected murderer. If you believe in his innocence, you have taken a very inconsistent course in spiriting him away to some hiding place of your own selection. I concealed his existence in his own interests and yours. Moreover, the thing was done at your husband's instigation, and with your husband's full approval. Had she been looking at him, she would have seen the conception of that lie flash across his face as he began the last sentence. Penrith was dead, and might be made responsible for everything. "God is very patient with you," she said with a quivering lip, "but I can endure no more." She turned from him and left the room, shutting the door behind her. His hands shook a good deal as he took out his cigar case. He failed to find it at first, though it was in the usual pocket, and lighted a consolatory cigar. "That's what I call a very unpleasant quarter of an hour," he muttered, "and I thought it was going to be worse." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 30. And the devil may pipe to his own. Her ladyship's carriage was at the door, with her ladyship's coachman on the box. The late Earl had had his people, and the Countess her people, and it was only the inferior portion of the domestic polity which owned allegiance to both. Her ladyship's personal possessions, piano, books, bibelots of all kinds, were packed in readiness for conveyance to Ellerslie in a waggon from the home farm, and before nightfall every trace of Sibyl's existence would have vanished from the castle on the marches, and the new lord would reign in undisturbed possession. The doors were open. The footmen were waiting to assist in their mistress's departure when Coralie came hastily out of the billiard room and approached her aunt. "Dear aunt, let me go with you. I did not know you were to leave today. I have only just heard about it, and you would have gone without even saying good-bye." "I have been too unhappy to think of leave-takings," answered Sibyl coldly, "and I am not going far away, only to Ellerslie." "Let me go with you. I won't bore you. I'll try not to be in your way." "Come to the drawing-room, Cora. I shall be ready in 5 minutes." The first sentence was spoken as she moved towards the drawing-room door. The second sentence was addressed to the footman who was carrying her wraps, and whose black silk hose were affording amusement to her ladyship's favourite collie, whose chain James was holding. "Now, Cora, let us be plain with each other," said Sibyl, turning to her husband's niece, with no touch of softness in voice or face. "What can you want of me? I can understand that I was useful to you when I took you from a lodging-house and an out-at-elbows father, but the whole aspect of your life has changed since last week. Your father is a rich man, and the master of both the houses in which you have lived lately. But he is still my father," said Coralie, deadly pale against the dull blackness of her morning gown. The dull black was by no means becoming to Cora's sallow complexion and plain features. Never had her lack of beauty been more apparent than in this moment, when her lips were whitened by emotion and her eyes haggard with weeping. "Your place is here, Cora, not with me." "My place is under no roof that shelters my father. I will never live in the same house with him, never live where I must see him day by day. I have made up my mind about that. Yes, you are justified in thinking meanly of me. I am a very Urquhart, a sordid, selfish creature. I like luxury. I revel in splendour and high living and fine clothes. I abhor poverty. I see no silver lining to the cloud that hangs over the shabby genteel, but for all that I would rather slave from morning till night among common drudges in a dressmaker's stuffy workroom than I would live in this house with my father." "Is this so, Coralie?" "It is so." "I have wronged you," said Sibyl gravely. "I have thought lately that you were your father's spy, set to watch my movements, full of malevolent curiosity." "Oh, only think that I admire and love you," cried Coralie, her sallow face crimsoning. "Whatever I may have been, whatever evil there is in my nature, I am honest and true today. I do respect you. I do love you. There have been hours in this house, in spite of all your goodness to me, when I have been envious of your fortune, your beauty, jealous of the worship your beauty won. But," struggling against sobs that almost choked her, "that is over now. I am resigned to my fate, resigned to see love pass me by, resigned to ugliness and spinsterhood. I only want to live a clean life, to hold no companionship with a man I cannot respect as a father should be respected. Let me live with you, Lady Penrith. You shan't find me troublesome or boring. I will give you as much or as little of my society day by day as you like. I will never pester you with attentions you don't want. I am not without what people call resources. I can amuse myself, and walk by myself, and live by myself, and under your roof I shall be happy and at ease." "What will your father say?" "Nothing that he can say will alter my determination never to live in this house. If you won't harbour me, I must earn my bread somehow, and live by myself." "Then you shall live with me. I will try to trust you and believe in you as I did a month ago. But remember that my life is a broken life. If you live with me, you must live secluded from society. A dreary existence for a girl of your age. No house parties in the country, no London season. In your father's present position, he can give you a life of pleasure and variety. As an only daughter and mistress of Penrith House, you will be a personage in London. You may marry well." No, I have made up my mind on that point. There shall be no more self-delusions. Let me share your solitude. Even if there were no other reason, it will be happy for me to drink that cup of humiliation which plain girls have to drink in the gay world, happier than sitting through dance after dance at the ball of the season, or hearing a crowd of young men whispering and tittering in the beautiful Mrs. Somebody's box next to my own, while I sit alone pretending to listen to the opera. All other considerations apart, rustic seclusion is the happiest fate for an unattractive girl. You are fond of exaggerating your deficiencies, Cora, but I won't dispute that point now," replied Sibyl with a faint smile. "You can follow me to Ellerslie if you like." "If I like? I shall go there with rapture. May I go to-night, as soon as my goods and chattels are packed?" "To-night or to-morrow, as you please." "To-night. It cannot be too soon. You won't change your mind and wire me not to go, do you?" "Cora, I am not that kind of person." No, you are as steadfast as a rock. You are all that is good and noble in womankind, and I will try to be worthy of your love. I mean you to love me, and trust me, and believe in me as if I were of your own stainless race." They went out to the hall door together, and Cora stood on the steps with the wind blowing her hair off her large, intelligent forehead, till Lady Penrith's carriage vanished in the distance. It was 7:30. Cora's packing was finished. Her trunks and possessions were all carried downstairs, to be removed with the second waggon load of Lady Penrith's property, and Cora was dressed in her sealskin coat and hat, ready for departure in the dog-cart, which had been ordered to drive her to Ellerslie. It would be a long, dark drive, but Cora thought nothing of possible dangers or discomforts on the road. All she thought about just now was getting away from Killander Castle. The billiard-room door was open as she crossed the hall, and she could not resist going in for a last look round a room in which she had spent many pleasant hours. The men had been very gracious to her, even if she were in no wise attractive. They had laughed at her little jokes and flippant criticisms. They had taught her to handle her cue, and applauded her poor little breaks of 10 or 12, as if she had been a feminine Roberts. It had all been bright and gay in those October evenings with the shooters, when the logs had been piled on the hearth, and the little table for drink set out in the deep recess yonder, and she had been encouraged to mix brandies and sodas, and to make herself daintily useful, like an etherealized barmaid. That was all over now. There was no fire, and only a single oil lamp burnt dully over one end of the covered table. All was gloom and silence. Will men ever sit in this room and talk and laugh now my father is master here? She wondered. Are there any men on earth who can like him and trust him? The man of whom she was thinking met her on the threshold, and she turned to leave the room. "Where are you going?" he asked sharply. "To Ellerslie." "You should have enough manners to ask my leave. This is my house, and you are my daughter. You must pay no visits without consulting me beforehand. I forbid you to go to Ellerslie on any visit, long or short." She drew herself to her fullest height and looked at him with all the scorn a pert interrogative nose and thin, sensitive lips could express. "This is not a question of visiting, Lord Penrith," she answered, emphasising the title, which sounded so strange a form of address from daughter to father. "I am leaving this house for ever, and Ellerslie is the only home I have." "You will do nothing of the kind," he answered fiercely, with a savage grip of her wrist. She winced with pain, but looked defiantly at him, even while her lip quivered. "There is no use in that kind of thing," she said. "Your doing me bodily harm won't make any difference in my plan of life, unless you choose to shoot me," she added very slowly, looking him full in the face, "and so make sure of my obedience." He dropped her wrist and stood looking at her, changed in one instant from bully to craven. "Go your ways for a blatant hussy," he said in his most brutal voice. "You are not worth making a fuss about. Such a plain-headed one as you would be no ornament to your father's dinner table." He turned away and left her to take her departure without further interest. He had the castle to himself now, and in its loneliness it seemed to him about as cheerful as the castle at Inverness on the morning after King Duncan's bloody death. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 31. Let a passionless peace be my lot. A very few days served to re-establish Sibyl in her old home, and with the old housekeeper and the old secretary and some of the old servants still about her, it seemed to her almost as if the past 10 years had been one dreary dream, endless and infinite after the manner of dreams. Already in that strange exaggeration of time common after the shock of sudden bereavement, it seemed to her as if Lord Penrith had been long dead. Already she was accustomed to the thought of his quiet resting place on the hillside, to the idea of herself as a widow, childless and alone in the world. There was an unspeakable comfort in the return to Ellerslie, comfort which even the horror that brooded over one unvisited spot in the wood could not spoil. The old associations of childhood were so many and so dear. The image of her indulgent father, the fainter image of the fair young mother, looking at her out of the cloudland of childish memories, like a picture of the Madonna looking benignly downward upon the worshippers at her altar through a cloud of incense. These, and with these, many a recollection of her happy girlhood filled the rooms and gardens with tender, peaceful thoughts There were sad thoughts, too, the chief among them the memory of him who was now far away on the northward side of the Tweed, a wreck of the past, so changed, so broken, that it was difficult to believe that feeble invalid was actually the same man, the same frame, animated by the same spirit, whom she admired and loved at Ellerslie. The shock of her husband's sudden death had fallen heavily upon her. She had done her duty as a loyal and obedient wife. She had spent her fortune upon his estate with a lavish hand, had never reminded him that all he enjoyed of worldly prosperity had its source in the Higginson coffers. She had indulged no whim that he disapproved, had consorted with no acquaintance whom he disliked, had indeed been much more conciliating and obedient than many a wife who marries for love, and who talks of her husband in the first year of marriage as if a god had descended from Olympus to be her mate. Yet, faithful as she had been in small things and in great, she looked back now with a touch of remorse. The atmosphere of wedded life had been colder than it need have been, perhaps. A little affection on her side might have warmed that hard nature into love. And then the thought flashed upon her that the mutual lack of love had made a peaceful union. If he had loved me, I should have hated him, she said to herself. It was better for both of us that our marriage was only a bargain entered into deliberately on both sides. We did not try to deceive each other. In our dealings with those who are gone forever, there is always something to regret, some reason for that dull aching of the heart which means remorse, some bitter memory, something said which ought not to have been said, some kindly word or act omitted when the opportunity for kindness was so obvious. Sibyl Penrith was very humble in all her thoughts of that married life which had closed like a story that ends unexpectedly at the turn of a leaf, and leaves the reader wondering. In her thought of the future possibilities, she had never imagined herself released from the marriage bond. She had accepted her position for life. She had looked down the long vista of joyless years, seeing herself still Lady Penrith, going about the world by the side of a man who cared very little about her, for whom she had never cared very much. He was gone, and she mourned for him as a fellow creature snatched away in the strength of his days, a man to whom life must have been much more precious than it was to that poor sufferer on whose changed aspect she had looked with unutterable grief, whose haggard face was a haunting presence in her life. Archibald Penrith was gone, and the man she abhorred reigned in his stead, and she thought with a shudder of that border fortress which had so lately been her home. A letter from John Coverdale, written at his East End vicarage, gave Lady Penrith tidings of Brandon Mountford after she had waited many anxious days for any news of him. St. Stephen's Vicarage, Honduras Square, E. Dear Lady Penrith, I have allowed some little time to pass before writing to you, not wishing to break in upon the sadness of your life while your sorrow was still a new thing. I will not presume to suggest the consolations that alone can help you in this terrible bereavement, or to write to you of that divine source of all comfort to which I feel very sure you have been led without the intervention of any human kind. God bless and comfort you, and help and sustain you in strong and fearless faith through this and every dark path you have tread. So far as one has been taught that the way to heaven lies through thorny paths, may make the earthly happiness of a friend the subject of his prayers, be sure my fervent supplications will rise day by day to the Eternal Father for you. And now to tell you of your kinsman and my charge. The journey was managed easily, and without any signs of exhaustion in the invalid. He slept a good deal, and his sleep was peaceful, and I thought him brighter and more interested in surrounding objects during the early morning drive from the station to the shooting lodge than in my previous observation of him. The doctor accompanied us to the end of our journey, and gave the most precise instructions to the attendant from the hospital, who was a strongly built man of about 30, accustomed to difficult cases, and equal, I believe, to any emergency. The housekeeper at the lodge and her husband are both people I can rely upon for faithful service, and all their warmest feelings are aroused by the patient in their care. I have therefore felt justified in leaving him in the care of those servants and his trained nurse, supervised by a daily visit from the nearest medical man, until I am able to return to Argyllshire, which I hope to do in about a fortnight. The plan which I would propose for the winter is to hire a small house at Rothsey, where the climate is much milder than that of the Argyllshire hills, and to place him there in charge of his present attendant and any servants you may be able to send from Ellerslie, people whom you can be sure for absolute silence as to his past. I can think of no better plan than this. My Scotch doctor was of Mr. Sanderson's opinion that nothing more could be done for the patient than we are doing now. A quiet life, with as much open air as the season will allow, a plain and nourishing diet, and bromide of potassium are all the treatment he prescribes. He will be happy to meet a physician from Glasgow or Edinburgh in consultation should you desire a second opinion, but he assures me that the consultation would result only in the approval of his treatment. It is my duty to add that he does not hope for much improvement under the happiest conditions. The long continuance of the disease has weakened the brain, and a kind of atrophy has wasted the frame. Any permanent revival of bodily strength or intellectual power would be a miracle in nature which he dares not hope to see. I tell you his opinion in all frankness, dear Lady Penrith, thinking it right that you should know the worst about your unhappy friend. Flashes of reviving memory, intervals of brightness in the dull torpor of his usual condition there may be, but these brief periods of improvement must not mislead or beguile us with a vain hope. For myself, you may be surprised to hear that I am about to abandon my flock in this hard-working eastern London, but if I leave them in the hands of a man who has worked with me as senior curate during the greater part of my residence here, who understands this parish thoroughly, and who is my superior in working power, my father, whose health has been gradually failing for the last 2 or 3 years, has persuaded me to accept the living at St. Stephen's, Workington. He now rarely comes to London, and his life is chiefly spent at his seat near Workington, so I can but feel that it is my duty, as it will be my happiness, to live within easy reach of him. I shall find plenty to do at St. Stephen's, for parish and church have both been neglected under the rule of an absentee rector, who died at Torquay the other day. The living is in my father's gift, and it has long been his desire that I should hold it. I hope to have wound up my affairs here in less than a fortnight, and to be established within an hour's journey of Ellerslie, where I will call upon you at any time you may appoint to discuss all arrangements for Mr. Mountford's residence at Rothesay or elsewhere. You might, if you pleased, remove him to Devonshire for the coming winter, but the journey would be long, and I doubt if you would find a better climate than that of Bute, even in the west of England. Ever faithfully yours, John Coverdale. Cora was with Lady Penrith when she received this letter. The girl recognised the strong, clear penmanship, bold yet with a certain precision which marked the man for whom order was an instinct. Cora gave a little sigh as she noted the length of the letter, and then discreetly moved to the other end of the room to leave her aunt free to read those closely written pages unobserved. She had subjugated the jealous agonies which had made her almost hate Sibyl Penrith, and had resigned herself to the idea of John Coverdale's affection for the beautiful widow. There was no help for it now. What man with sense or discrimination could think of her, Coralie, now that Lady Penrith was free to reward a lover's devotion? It was her business in life to be a looker-on, she told herself, and she must accept the portion that fate had allotted to her. All her thoughts and desires had taken a sombre cast. Her character had sobered curiously since her uncle's death, and a cloud of melancholy hung over her which brought her in sympathy with Sibyl's sorrows. For the first time since they had been associated, Sibyl's heart had warmed to the lonely, motherless girl. Heretofore all her kindness had been prompted by a sense of duty. Now there was actual liking, a far more cordial feeling than of old. Before Mr. Coverdale reappeared on the scene, Sibyl had told Coralie the story of Brandon Mountford's affliction and her girlish attachment to him, touching very lightly, with scrupulous reserve, on Urquhart's part in the tragedy. But Cora's keen eyes had watched the speaker's face, and Cora had divined much that was unspoken. "You had reason to detest my father, and yet you took me into your house and loaded me with benefits. Would any other woman in the world have done as much?" mused Cora at the end of the story. "Most women would have done as much, I hope, Cora, seeing your need of a friend. I tried to disassociate you from your father in all my thoughts. Why should you bear his burdens?" "Ah, but I was tainted with his bad blood. It was the old story of the adder warmed back to life and stinging the hand that had succoured it. My father told me to watch you, and I obeyed. He pretended to be your friend, and I pretended to believe him. I don't think I ever really believed him. I was grateful to you. I loved you at first, and then your beauty, your wealth, all your perfections began to gall. I made comparisons. I compared our faces as we stood side to side in front of the same glass. I compared our fortunes, and then the venom in my blood began to work. My nature could not escape the hereditary taint, if the modern craze about heredity has any foundation. I was my father's very daughter, and I accepted the office of spy. My whole mind changed towards you. The utter hopelessness of any little liking I might feel for the saintly parson saw him devote every thought and feeling to you." "Nonsense, Cora. You shouldn't talk in that absurd strain. Mr. Coverdale has been my kind friend in desperate crisis. That is all. I asked him to help me, and he responded with all kindness and chivalry. As for the past, let it be forgotten between us. I saw of late that you were very inquisitive about all my movements, and that you had some motive in your watchfulness. You were under your father's influence then, but I think you have escaped from that bad influence now." forever and forever. I hope never to look upon my father's face again." "I am glad you have been frank with me, Cora, even when frankness told against yourself. It will be the beginning of confidence between us. I like you ever so much better, now that I know the worst of you, from your own lips." Cora did not prove unworthy to be pardoned and trusted. All that there was of good in her nature developed and strengthened in daily association with a noble woman, and in that atmosphere of perfect peace which reigned at Ellerslie. As the winter wore on, that life was not all solitude and monotony, for the neighbouring gentry were assiduous in their attentions to the widowed countess, and Coralie Urquhart shared their attentions. If the widow held herself aloof from society, there was no reason that her niece should live in perpetual seclusion, and a few months after her uncle's death, Lady Coralie Urquhart's neat figure and thoroughbred air began to be known and even admired at various entertainments within 15 miles of Ellerslie. There was always some friendly matron eager to chaperone her to any dances or private theatricals in the neighbourhood. "There are some advantages in a plain face," said Cora. "The mother of a pretty daughter is never afraid that I shall make her swan a crow. I think Mrs. Simper rather likes taking me about with her, as a useful foil to Miss Simper's alabaster complexion." "But I am told that you are more admired than Miss Simper at Lady Hardacre's dance," said Sibyl, smiling at her niece's self-scorn. "It is no overwhelming honour to be preferred to an idiot with blue eyes that look as though they had been bought at Lowther Arcade," said Cora. "And then I got all the advantages of the smaller gentry's snobbishness. The second-rate young men like to dance with an earl's daughter, and Lady Coralie sounds better than Miss Simper in the ear of Bayswater or South Kensington. Lady Coralie. The name suggests a character in one of Gilbert's librettos. Even the courtesy title cannot give dignity to my absurd name. I can't imagine where my mother and father found it. Could the owner of the name have looked backward through the mists of time, she might have seen the hoardings of West End London decorated with a portrait of a certain Mademoiselle Coralie, who was delighting the gilded youth of the period by song and dance in the latest new burlesque at the favourite burlesque theatre. The lady was a Parisian, and spoke her lines with difficulty, but her broken English was an additional charm. Hubert Urquhart had been among her most ardent admirers, and had even been allowed the inestimable privilege of giving a very expensive supper party in her honour, at a period when his young country-bred wife was obliged to forego all gaieties. Then came the usual shilly-shally as to the naming of the firstborn. Urquhart, disappointed at the sex of the infant, was very casual in his share of the debate, but vetoed all the family names on his wife's side of the house as too fine or too ugly. "Call her Coralie, if you like," he said, looking up from his newspaper where a column was given to the new burlesque of Anthony and Cleopatra, in which Mademoiselle Coralie had startled the town with a wild dance with the asp. Coralie is a very pretty name. Even his mother-in-law, who generally disagreed with him, conceded this point. Coralie was charming, novel, uncommon, and could be shortened to Cora, which was even still prettier. Coralie, let it be, then, said Urquhart as he walked off to the florist's to order a congratulatory basket of hyacinths, white waxen bells, just faintly touched with roseate shadows, for the lady with the asp. The Yorkshire parson's wife had arrived in London the previous evening, and it was not until some days after the christening that this good lady heard how the town was ringing with the fame of the burlesque actress from the Châtelet Theatre, and guessed that her granddaughter, the vicar's granddaughter, the potential archbishop's granddaughter, had been called after that unholy person. The winter passed peacefully for Lady Penrith. Cora kept her promise, and never intruded her society upon the widow's thoughtful hours. They walked and drove together, they met at luncheon and dinner, and they generally spent the after-dinner hour in each other's society. Sibyl perhaps dreaming over her favourite music at the piano at one end of the drawing-room, while Cora sat curled up in the most luxurious chair she could find at the other end of the room, absorbed in a novel. Cora had a cat-like love of warmth, and was always as close to the fire as she could be without being roasted alive. Lady Penrith preferred the cooler atmosphere by the piano, where the white lilac and palms made an indoor garden. Their tastes in music and books and pictures were utterly dissimilar, but they got on very comfortably together, and Cora's lighter nature, which gradually recovered from the shock that had sobered and depressed her, was a useful influence in Sibyl's existence. She might have sunk into a deeper melancholy and brooded more persistently after the shattered life of the man she loved if Cora had not been at hand with her keen observation and her never-failing perception of the humorous side of all earthly things. Cora amused her with descriptions of county festivities and her comments on county people, their limited horizons, their exaggerated estimate of local importance, their indifference to all the great movements of the age, social, scientific, and literary. Cora accompanied her in all her cottage visiting, and the little seaport, in the miners' villages, to the schools, and the cottage hospital, and Cora had grown a great deal more sympathetic since she left Killander Castle, and was ripening day by day in her power of understanding the working classes. They no longer seemed to her all of one type and pattern, all the lower order of beings, with hands stretched automatically to receive gifts from the rich. She was beginning to find out strong individualities among the masses, to find that hardly one cottager resembled another in character or instincts, and that though very few of them might be faultless, and all of them might be what they called having, there was a strong substratum of goodness which never failed when one dug down to it. Kindness and pity for one's own class, unselfish readiness to help each other, and a willingness to make substantial sacrifices, with a good deal less fuss and talk than would accompany the same amount of self-surrender in their betters. Wives bore with drunken husbands, and held their tongue when the week's wage was spent at the public house. Husbands nursed the children, and waited upon their wives in sickness. Grandfathers and grandmothers stinted themselves to feed children whose unauthorized entrance upon the scene had brought them trouble and disgrace. Everywhere, under the roughest outer seeming, Coralie found the deep heart of human love. "I used to hate the poor when you first took me among them," she frankly avowed one day after a long round with Sibyl, "but I begin to see that they are not a bad sort, and I wonder less at the interest you take in them." They were not at Ellerslie all the winter. Andrew Orlebar had been dispatched to Rothsay immediately after a visit from the new rector of Workington, with instructions to hire the most comfortable house with the best aspect that he could find in that much praised watering place, and to that house, a villa on the slope of a hill fronting the south and commanding an extensive view of the mountains and sea, Brandon Mountford had been removed. Here was provided every amelioration which thought or science could devise for a life obviously dwindling towards its close. And here Lady Penrith and Cora came from time to time on visits of a week or a fortnight, during which visits some hours of every day were spent with the invalid. His condition was far happier than it had been in his captivity at St. Jude's. There were some times when he seemed fully to realise all that affection had done for him, but nothing could mend the broken life or arrest mental decay, and Sibyl had to submit to the sad realities of the case. The Brandon Mountford, by whose side she sat in the pretty drawing-room at Rothsey, the man whose hand often lay cold and listless in her own, was not the Brandon Mountford she had known 10 years ago. Nothing could bring back that lost personality. This patient sufferer, weak-brained, joyless, indifferent to all the loveliness of earth and sky and sea, had nothing in common with the Brandon of the past, and alas, this state of dull apathy was the happier condition of his present life, for from time to time there came periods of stormy agitation, the throes and convulsions, the purple face and glittering eyes of the epileptic, and it needed all Sibyl's faith to believe the doctors when they assured her that the patient himself had no consciousness of those convulsive struggles, nor any memory of them when reason returned, only a vague melancholy, a dim sense of shame, and the apathy of weariness. Could she wish such a life prolonged? Yes, affection valued even this shattered existence. All that she saw of weakness and decay could not extinguish the hope of cure. The ill treatment of 10 years was not to be undone by a few months of careful nursing, she argued. His cure must be a question of time. She would not accept adverse opinions, and when the doctors shook their heads or murmured some ambiguous phrase which implied a hopeless verdict, she argued against their experience and refused to foresee the inevitable. A yacht was being built for her in one of the shipbuilders' yards on the Clyde, and she was planning a cruise to the Mediterranean as soon as the boat was ready to sail, a cruise during which Brandon might reawaken to a new life, transformed by sea air and frequent change of scene, the exhilarating sense of novelty in the movement from one spot of loveliness to another, as they coasted between Marseilles and Naples, or beneath Algeria's romantic hills. The end came suddenly before the yacht was finished. Suddenly and peacefully. The life so racked and worn failed all at once, and Sibyl felt as though her life must be objectless henceforth. She was at Ellerslie when Brandon died, having left him only a few days before, and it was John Coverdale who came as the messenger of death. John Coverdale, whose sympathy and help had sustained her through every difficulty, from the hour she entered St. Jude's vicarage with him at her side. It was over. Her grief expressed itself in no vehement form. There was only the crushing sense of loss and of disappointment, the feeling that the business of her life was finished, and that all she had ever known of the poetry of existence lay buried in Brandon Mountford's grave. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 32. For is not God Almighty? Brandon Mountford had been lying in his quiet grave at Rothsea for some weeks when the yacht which should have carried him to a summer sea was ready to leave by the shipbuilder's yard. And it seemed to Sibyl that there could be no more useless toy than the boat which she had built for his sake and which his eyes had never looked upon. All Coverdale's powers of persuasion were needed to awaken her from the apathy of grief into which she had sunk, and to induce her to start a cruise for her own benefit. But, warmly seconded by Cora, his arguments finally prevailed, and before the spring was over, the Esperance was sailing southward with Lady Penrith, Cora, and Lady Selina, and 2 young cousins, naval and military, by way of escort. The spinster aunt had swooped down from a great house in North Riding, where she had been making a very long visit to one of her wealthiest nieces, a lady with a large heart and a populous nursery, and with whom Aunt Selina was an esteemed authority upon all juvenile ailments. Life on board the Esperance afforded a pleasant relief from the atmosphere of measles, whooping cough, and humdrum at Waddingley Park, and Lady Selina resigned herself to the loss of a London season, thereby putting money in her purse, while she enjoyed the dolce far in Sicilian waters or in the Greek archipelago. And so the spring months passed away, and in June Lady Penrith and her party landed at Genoa, leaving the yacht to go round to Marseille in charge of the naval cousin, to be berthed there until her next cruise, while the 3 ladies settled quietly at Bellagio till the end of the month, when Lady Selina went back to England, and Sibyl and Cora moved northward to the Tyrol for July, August, and September, only returning to Cumberland in October. Then came the long, quiet winter, with friends fit but few, and for their most frequent visitor, Mr. Coverdale, from his cure of souls at Workington, where he was doing good service among a crowded mining population. It was a comfort both to Sibyl and Cora in those quiet days of autumn and early winter to know that the new Lord Penrith was not living at Callander Castle. He had indeed been there very little since he came to his estate. He was not popular in the neighbourhood, and he had frankly expressed his hatred of place and people. He had spent the winter after his brother's death at Monte Carlo, where he had achieved all he desired of fame by his success in pigeon shooting, and the society papers reported that he was at Monte Carlo this winter, also that he had been laid up in Paris during the whole of November, and had been operated upon by a famous French surgeon, the nature of the operation not being stated. A letter from Lady Selina, who had been dissipating in the brief gaieties of a November session, informed her niece that Lord Penrith had been suffering from a tumour on the face, which was likely to cause lifelong disfigurement, and that the people at Monte Carlo found him very much altered from last season. An inquiry at the castle, made personally by Mr. Orlebar, confirmed this account. His lordship had been very ill, and still an invalid. He was expected to spend the rest of the winter at Monte Carlo, where he had taken a small villa near the casino. He is your father, Cora, and you may consider it your duty to go to him in his affliction. Sibyl said gravely when she and Cora had heard Orlebar's report. He is my father, but I recognize no duty where he is concerned except the duty of silence, Cora answered with a look so grave and resolute that Lady Penrith felt that there was no more to be said. She knew enough of Coralie by this time to know that the girl was not heartless, and that her repudiation of all filial duty must needs be based upon some sufficient reason. There was nothing flippant or reckless in the daughter's manner. She dismissed the subject sternly, with solemn decision of purpose, as a Roman daughter might have done. Brooding over the girl's conduct, Sibyl arrived at the conclusion that Cora had investigated the story of Marie Arnold's death and believed her father to be the murderer. Some cause as grave would alone justify her conduct. It was a shock for the nerves of both women when they heard early in the year that Lord Penrith was at the castle. He had been brought there, marked for death. Mr. Dewsnap told Lady Penrith one afternoon early in March, when they met beside a cottager's sick-bed about a week after the Earl's return. "Is the case really so hopeless?" she asked. "I fear so. All that surgery can do for him has been done in Paris and here. The last word has been said. I saw him this morning. I see him 3 or 4 times a day, but there is nothing for me to do except regulate the amount of morphia that is given to him. He has excellent nurses. Dr. Malcolm comes from Edinburgh every 3rd day, but science can do no more for him, and the only relief is the inevitable end of all things. Life can be nothing but a burden to him, yet he clings to life with almost frantic intensity. Has he ever spoken to you of his daughter?" Lady Penrith asked when she and the doctor had left the cottage and were walking along the village street together. "No, the greater part of his days and nights are spent under the influence of narcotics, and the realities of life outside his own room affect him very little. He asks for no friend, doesn't care who waits on him, values his nurses for their skill and nothing else. He told me this morning that there was a time when he wanted fresh young faces about him, pretty faces for choice, but now he would have Gorgons if Gorgons had more skill in nursing than the pretty young women. He is very often in a state of semi-delirium, and he acts hideous tragedies in a kind of waking drama, a common symptom when the brain is steeped in morphia." "Unhappy creature! Then there is no hope for him. He must die?" "He must die, and in his case no one can regret the end, since it is the only possible release from suffering." Sibyl wrote an account of this interview in a letter to John Coverdale. "Pray go to him, and if you can turn his thoughts to God and persuade him to confess his sins, it will be one more good work done," she wrote. Her desire was obeyed, and it was not possible for a Christian priest to approach the bed of suffering with more kindliness and discretion than marked Mr. Coverdale's visit to Lord Penrith. The 2 men had met in the past, and Coverdale entered the sick room as a friend, but here friendliness was of no avail. The sufferer treated him with savage insolence and ordered him out of the room. "I know your craft," he muttered. "You sneak into my bedside under the guise of friendship. A man with whom I never had one thought or feeling in common, and presently you will bring a little black book out of your pocket and drop on your knees and pray me into worse horrors than those I suffer now. I don't want you or your mumbo-jumbo, your abracadabra. Go to your starving miners and wash your worn-out jargon down their thirsty throats with soup and wine. They'll swallow one thing with the other, but don't come here. Johnstone, show that gentleman the door. If that won't do, throw him downstairs. I've no use for him here." He laughed a spasmodic laugh at the American slang which closed his speech. His eyes were deeply sunken. Forehead and cheek were livid, and all the lower part of his face was hidden by linen bandages. Lazarus coming out of the tomb was the image which flashed into Coverdale's mind as he looked in sorrowful reproach at that dreadful countenance. A wicked Lazarus, with malignity burning in those sunken eyes. A Lazarus summoned, not out of the grave's dreamless slumber, but out of hell fire. Mr. Coverdale told Lady Penrith that his visit had been ineffectual, but he told her nothing more. He would not sadden her by any description of that bed of doom. It needs something higher than human influence to touch that hardened heart, he said. We can but leave the sinner to his God. The only deathbed repentance that is not an idle mockery is the repentance that comes from within, not from without. The sinner may find God in his own heart, even after he has mocked at Christ's message from the lips of the priest. It was more than a week after this when a letter was brought to Lady Penrith, sitting alone in the March twilight. The note had been delivered by a groom from the castle, who was to wait for her ladyship's answer before he rode back. She told the servant to return in a few minutes, when her answer would be ready, and then she went to the window to read her letter by the fading daylight, while the footman lighted the lamp on her writing table. The envelope was addressed in a strange hand. The letter was written in pencil, and except that it was on thick vellum paper and headed with a castle address, it was almost as uncanny a scrawl as that which the ragged messenger threw into her lap on the moor. "The doctors tell me my end is near. You have suspected and hated me for the last 12 years. It may gratify you to know that you had reason. Come and hear my confession, and if you want to hear it, come at once. My life is like a thin little flame in a spirit lamp, sustained by strong stimulants, and will soon vanish into darkness. Don't be afraid that you will hear a pulling deathbed repentance. I believe in neither pardon nor pity. I die the victim of an inexorable scheme of creation, which includes the horrors of disease that torture and kill, damnable maladies which no human skill can cure. Do you think that any man, doomed as I am doomed, is likely to go out of this life listening to twaddle about divine beneficence? I shall be with you as soon as my carriage can bring me." These words were written hastily and thrust into an envelope as the servant re-entered the room to receive Lady Penrith's order for her coachman. The light phaeton with a pair of horses was to be got ready immediately. "Lady Coralie has not come in yet, I suppose?" "No, my lady. When she comes, be sure she is told that I have been sent for to the castle. She is not to wait dinner." Cora, who had taken very kindly to writing since she came to Ellerslie, and who had always been well mounted by her aunt's liberal care, was out with the hounds. Cora was a success in the hunting field, where light hands, a neat waist, and indomitable pluck, tempered with common sense, scored almost as high as a handsome face. Beauty blundering over a hound, or beauty getting in the way at the gate, is not altogether precious to the sportsman. The deep shadow of night was round the gaunt grey fortress, and the darker shadow of death was in the room when Sibyl approached the sick bed and seated herself silently in the place which the nurse indicated, a large armchair at the head of the bed, besides those heaped-up pillows from which the ghastly face looked out, white as the linen from which it was bandaged, pinched by the invisible hand which had set its mark upon every feature. "Leave me alone with Lady Penrith." The voice was low and muffled, utterly changed from the metallic hardness of Hubert Urquhart's enunciation. The two nurses vanished through a curtained door that opened into a dressing-room, where all the paraphernalia of the sportsman's toilet had been swept away to give space for the apparatus of sickness. Kettles and saucepans and spirit lamps, new inventions for comfort or relief, extravagant in price and infinitesimal in value to the sufferer, contrivances tried once, perhaps, and never tried again, the dreary details in the history of failure. Hubert Urquhart looked at his brother's widow with a cynical smile, a smile on lips contracted by pain. "I thought my letter would fetch you," he said. "You have come to see God's judgment upon a sinner. You remember how Herod the king was eaten of worms and gave up the ghost, an example of God's judgment, swift and sharp, a ready money vengeance. And now you think that this cancer which is killing me is God's judgment upon murder. Bosh, Lady Penrith. Clerical spuffle. There are good men and women all over the world doomed just as I am doomed, with pain as lingering, with a fate as hopeless, Christians of purest water, shining lights in the darkness of this world, suffering just as I suffer. When you, and such as you, talk of them, you give your God praise for the blessed example of their affliction, and recognize the ineffable wisdom that tortures and kills. You see me stricken down, and you exalt God, the Avenger. You see no inconsistency in the hand that strikes wolves and lambs with the same rod. Come, own that your heart burns with triumph at seeing this living wreck which I still call me. A few hours hence, the undertakers will be talking of it. I am sorry for you as I can be, remembering what Brandon Mountford suffered. He suffered? Why, his life was a life of ease and comfort. His 10 dull years were no worse than one dull afternoon, measured against what I have suffered in the last 6 months. Don't waste your pity upon an epileptic, whose convulsions may be ugly to look at, but leave no memory, inflict no pain upon the patient. He suffer? Keep your pity for the man whose tortured consciousness no narcotic can annihilate, whose sleep has been peopled and spun out into seemingly eternity by dreams of indescribable horror. And where do you think those dreams took me, Lady Penrith? What do you suppose was the almost invariable background of those hideous fantasies? The wood where you killed Marie Arnold, she answered, her eyes looking into his as he sat up in the bed, grasping her hand with his clammy fingers and bringing his bandaged face near hers so that she might hear the feeble voice. You are good at guessing. Yes, that is the place where the morphia fiend leads me. He takes me by the hand, a little black devil with a mocking grin. His skinny hand clutches mine, and he drags me into the wood, and she is there, lovely and cruel as she was that evening in the golden sunset. Oh, God, how beautiful her eyes were with that golden light reflected on their velvet darkness. How cold, how cruel. Such bitter, scathing words, hatred of me, love of your lover, hatred that turned to loathing when I drew her to my breast and kissed her reluctant lips and tried to make her understand that passionate love like mine was to be valued or to be feared. And if she would not have me for her husband and take her chance of my doing well in life and making a great lady of her, I would be revenged on her somehow. A love like mine was not to be trifled with any more than a raging fire. But she was so bold and so proud. She flung me off her with her strong young arms. She laughed at my passion and my threats. She accused me of only wanting Sir Joseph's money, not really caring for her. She was so strong, such a grand creature in her strength and beauty. And I had a knife in my breast pocket, Mountford's knife, which I happened to have borrowed a day or two before, and clutching at my breast, beside myself with passion, I felt the knife and knew that it was there. You can guess the rest. You may remember that I was late for dinner, but that I sat down with you and your father, and was wanting in no observance of a gentleman. It was not till a long time afterwards that you began to suspect me. Sibyl heard him in silence, and remained silent now when the bloodless fingers loosened from her hand, and he sank back among the pillows, exhausted by the most sustained effort that he had made for a long time. His breath came and went in hoarse pantings, his wan hands moved restlessly upon the coverlet, and those haggard, bloodshot eyes rolled wildly in their orbits as he looked at Sibyl's white face. "Have you nothing to say?" he gasped at length. "Nothing. God help you in this dark end of your wicked life." "You're not surprised at my confession?" No, I knew you were the murderer. I have been convinced of that for a long time. You broke my father's heart, shortened his life. You spoilt Brandon's life and mine, and your victim, that young, bright life. There never was a crueler murder. What good can I do here? Pray to God for your pardon. What I think or feel can matter nothing to you. You can restore nothing, undo nothing. No, the past is the past. I cannot bring Marie Arnold back to life. I would have given 20 years of my life to undo that. 20 years, did I say? I would have given all that was left of my life for one day with her, to die, knowing that I had not killed her, that the murder in the wood was only a hideous dream. Call the nurse. It is time for my morphia. The pain, the racking pain is beginning. I must have my dose. And then the morphia fiend will take me by the hand and lead me under the fir trees, treading the paths where our footsteps have no sound on the fir needles, and I shall see her again in her white gown with a red gash across her throat. The nurses came, quiet, prompt, with quick movements of skillful hands, one on each side of the bed, one supporting the patient, while the other administered the narcotic. Sibyl sank on her knees at the foot of the bed, and with bent brow and covered face, breathed a prayer for God's mercy to a dying sinner. Then she nodded a silent good night to the nurses and stole softly from the room. Those trained hands had rearranged the disordered pillows, had placed the sufferer's head in an easier position, had smoothed the silken coverlet, laying it lightly over the wasted frame, and the morphia was already at work, tranquilizing the limbs, creeping through the labyrinth of the brain, giving respite from bodily torture, but bringing with it dreams that racked the mind. In Hubert Urquhart's confession of past guilt, there had been no word of a still darker crime, a crime planned in cold blood, thought out and slowly resolved upon, carried out with unwavering craft and purpose, and with as little compunction as the hunter feels for the agonies of a noble beast tracked across the wilderness, watched and waited for and slain without mercy. Of that crime which Coralie knew, not one word had escaped the murderer on his deathbed, and the daughter's knowledge of that dreadful secret remained unshared and unsuspected. Lord Penrith lingered for more than a week after his interview with Sibyl, but in those last days and nights were one long morphia sleep and an almost unbroken pilgrimage through the dark maze of hideous memories. The skill and the care of doctors and nurses were employed to keep him alive when nature would have let him die, and to reduce life to unconsciousness throughout those extra hours wrested from death. At last the end came, only a sinking deeper into that morphia darkness, only the fall of death's curtain on those distorted memories of past sin. A gentlemanlike vulture in the shape of an undertaker came post-haste from Carlisle, and took possession of that which had been Hubert, 10th Earl of Penrith. There was a stately funeral, an earl's coronet upon a velvet coffin, an open hearse like a triumphal car, with 6 black horses tossing their Flemish heads and curving their heavy Flemish necks, and all the neighbouring gentry sent their empty carriages to express respect for a man who had been universally disliked and whose absenteeism had been regarded, except by the local tradespeople, as a merciful dispensation. The distant cousin who succeeded to the title and entailed estates was an elderly gentleman of unblemished respectability, with a large family of sons and daughters. The sons sporting, the daughters plain, pious, and hopelessly unfashionable, just the sort of people to spend 10 months of the year at the castle, and to furnish an eldest son who would stand for that division of the county, and to protect local interests in the stress and storm of the imperial parliament. The new earl and his family were aware how much of their prosperity they owed to the Dowager Lady Penrith, and they took pains to cultivate her friendship and to be civil to Coralie Urquhart, who had been so unaccountably estranged from her father. Postscript. What remains to be told of Sibyl's life history? Another year of quiet widowhood, in spite of the pleading of a devoted lover, and then, on a grey morning at the beginning of the year, the plainest of weddings in the parish church at Ardliston. Husband and wife went straight from the church to the station, and thence to London, on the first stage of their journey to Rome, to that city of churches, where it was John Coverdale's delight to expound ecclesiastical history written in all that there is of architectural grandeur, from the grey antiquity of St. Clemente to the gleaming granite and modern mosaics of the mighty basilica which commemorates the martyrdom of St. Paul. An Italian honeymoon which lasted from winter to spring, yet seemed only too brief, and early in April Sibyl and her husband left Florence regretfully on their return to England, he to resume the burden of duty, not among the miners at Workington, but in a populous and wealthy centre in East Riding, where the fine old church is only a little less than a cathedral in spaciousness and beauty, a cure which has always been held by a churchman of mark, and has always been regarded as the prelude to higher dignities. John Coverdale has made himself known as a fine preacher and indefatigable worker. A preacher with all the philosophical breadth of Liddon and the magnetic personality of Frederick Robertson. A preacher who has been able to beguile the rough miners from their Sabbath luxury of shirt-sleeves and laziness, dog-fights and rat-catching, and to hold them spellbound by his impassioned appeals to that best side of human thought and feeling which will always answer to him who knows how to call. The man whom Coralie described as cold, precise, and priggish has shown himself gifted with the finest qualities of preacher and priest, and he is warmly welcomed to the greatest Yorkshire city by all that is best and most cultivated among the community. Difficulties and dissensions will arise, doubtless, in some quarters, for Coverdale has a strong hand in the reform of old abuses, and is one of those men of whom it is said that they will always have their own way. But his way is a good way, and his influence is a good influence for all in his parish, most of all for the poor, and for those who most need the awakening call, the stringent yet tender hand leading them into the fold. This busy centre, Sibyl learns to understand new phases of life. She finds herself no longer in a small community where one's wealth can achieve wonders of order and prosperity, and one man's influence can shape all the things to his liking, but in the thick of the bitter battle among the revolts and conspiracies of labour against capital, and the exactions and injustices of capital against labour, the contest of strength with strength, the appeals to public opinion, the power, sometimes reckless and fatal, sometimes wise and beneficent, of a free press, the heat and strife of politics. Here she must live through seasons of fear and sadness, the terrors of a fever-stricken town, the alternations of local prosperity, good times and bad times, the collapse of great enterprises, the ruin of great commercial houses that have been ranked among the wealthiest. Here she has to learn the lesson of life in all its stern reality, and here she has to discover how little her wealth can do, where needs are so constant and so manifold, that her fortune and her life labour are used for the help of the suffering, for the reclamation of the lost. None who ever knew could doubt. "My aunt is a saint," said Cora, perched daintily on her hunting saddle, sitting in a sheltered corner waiting for the fox to break cover, and chatting cheerily with a group of admirers. My aunt lives only to do good to other people, and she could not have done better than to marry Mr. Coverdale, who is a remarkable man, and would have made an admirable pope in the days when popes did a great deal more good or a great deal more harm to the world than they can do now. Coralie has no lack of admirers in these latter days. She is no longer the Coralie Urquhart, for Mr. Nicholas Hildrop, of Hildrop Grange, near Workington, has allowed himself to fall a victim to her sharp tongue, neat figure, light hands, and good seat. And meeting and conversing with her through a couple of seasons, mounted on all that is handsomest in thoroughbred hunters, has come gradually to believe that Cora is as good-looking as her horses, and has made her mistress of himself and his estate. Lady Coralie Hildrop gives hunting breakfasts, has a furnished house in Mayfair for the season, goes everywhere, is liked by a good many people and feared by the rest, is mundane to the tips of her fingers, an affectionate wife, a good friend, a bitter enemy, and without mercy for any pretty woman who misbehaves herself. The end. End of chapter 32. End of Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon.